Hey guys, what is happening, and welcome to my first ever whiteboard video. So I couldn't do this video without crediting George Gammon and Rebel Capitalist. Go check them out, links are going to be in the description. George Gammon, he is the king of whiteboard videos. I really wanted to come and do a whiteboard video to show you a scenario that could play out in the housing market, different fundamentals that are at play. And it's easier to see it if we just do it on a whiteboard and really describe it. Now, I'm 6'2", so the proportions of this whiteboard are bigger than they look. So it's not a miniature whiteboard, but I'm just gonna go with what I already had. So without further ado, guys, let's do this. Alright guys, please first of all hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and we're going to go through this right now. So all these lines that I've got all over the whiteboard, I'm going to explain each one and we'll go through them. This is probably going to end up being a longer video than my usual videos, but nevertheless you're going to want to watch this video because this is an important scenario that I think is actually very probable to happen. Now that doesn't mean it's going to happen, and you have to remember that after 2022 I really don't know what's going to happen, and that's just forecasting. So anyway guys, let's get into this. So the first thing is interest rates, and we've got 2020 right there, and this is obviously the 2019 period. So if we follow that line, we know what happened with interest rates. Interest rates went to rock bottom during the cerveza sickness. So the effect of that was debt got a lot cheaper, and this has happened many times in the past, but people forget it, they don't want to remember it, is housing bubbles and asset bubbles are inflated by the lowering of interest rates. This happened and it fueled the 1989 bubble that collapsed, and it's happening right now. So it's interesting because obviously you had the cerveza sickness, interest rates dropped, and then obviously if we follow that, they are predicted to start rising, and I've got them pegged at going to 1.25%. Now, I'm skeptical to whether we'll get to 1.25%, but it's going to be interesting nevertheless, so strap in folks. So first of all, we're going to look at housing demand as well. So the second thing, housing demand, is this blue line here. So obviously, and this is interesting, and I really want to point this out because actually housing demand started increasing towards the tail end of 2019, which is kind of weird, isn't it? But there's more weird signs that we'll go over later. So it started increasing. That housing demand, obviously there was a little blip in it for the cerveza sickness, and then it kind of flattened off throughout most of 2020 before taking off to the moon in this rocket right here during 2021. And we had this massive up in prices. Now, what I'm predicting is at some point in 2022, the market is going to level off. Another thing that is very hard to forecast is how long it's going to level off for, because there is so much debt in the system. It could be a much shorter period of time than I've got there because there's so much debt in the system and so much fear baked into that system as well. So the next thing we're going to go over is housing supply, which also in the tail end of 2019 was actually decreasing. And that just continued to happen. It obviously amplified during 2021, and we bottomed out right here where we are right now. And I think we're at a bottom in the housing supply. And I want to emphasize something here. It's not good when you have such a divergence, which I've illustrated here, between the supply and the demand. because that doesn't mean that sellers have just become non-existent. It means that they are holding off for some reason, and we know exactly why that reason is, which we're going to go over later, and that's house prices. So housing supply very low. Another reason housing supply was kept low throughout 2020 was the cerveza sickness. People didn't want random people coming into their homes. People who had homes were now using them as home offices, single family homes. So they didn't really see any rush to the market. So that really has kept the supply very, very low. Now, inflation, that's an interesting thing. So inflation was around 2% heading into this. It dipped down. It went negative for, I think, 1 month and then back up. And it has gone absolutely parabolic. And we're right here in 2022 where it's at nearly 5%. And I've marked out 4% right there as well. So inflation has also gone to the moon. Now, the funny thing is the next thing, which is a metric that I came up with myself, but is very, very important. And there's different ways that you could describe this. Mine is probably horrible, but I'm calling this the household income / spend gap. So it's basically the gap between after everybody's bills, their mortgage, what they have left to spend into the economy. So it's that discretionary spending. So what happened, interestingly, was it was fairly flat down here, but when interest rates went down, it actually spiked up. You had a very short time frame when actually, because of deflationary pressures and the fact interest rates were lower, that people's household income / spend gap increased significantly. And this is the firepower and the igniter fluid to light a housing bubble. This is how you light a housing bubble, because then you've got a flood of people that can suddenly afford to buy a bigger house or whatever it is. And that's exactly what fueled it. So during the course of 2020, that just dwindled down. And by the time we got to 2021, we were roughly at the same place we were before we started. But now, interestingly enough, we've seen this just go down and down and down, as well as inflation has gone up and as well as the cost of housing has gone up. So this is really, really important to remember. I think this household income and spend gap is incredibly important because this is a future indicator of a recession. If people have less money to spend into the real economy, that means recession. And we know that oil prices once again closed at a record high just on Friday. It's January the 16th right now. So inflation is just going to continue. And as Jeff Snyder says, and he does a great podcast on Spotify with Emil, I'll leave a link to that as well, where he talks about oil prices are heavily correlated with recessions. When they go high, people have to spend on energy. Food and energy and shelter, these three things are the core things that people can't not spend money on. So the fact that the core CPI is exploding is dangerous because it means that people have less money to spend into the real economy. And then we have house prices. House prices have pretty much followed the supply, creating this massive divergence also. And that is really because supply has gone down, so that's amplified those price gains because speculation just becomes so much more entrenched when housing supply is low. It takes less people to manipulate prices and manipulate a market. This is why penny stocks on the stock market are often pump and dump schemes, because they're low volume, so hedge funds can come in, pump them a little bit, wait for the momentum to drag them up even further, and then dump all their positions. And it's also happening in the crypto market. There are millions of cryptos out there which are essentially Ponzi schemes and act the same way. But nevertheless, it's hugely important to note these two things after here during 2022. And this may occur later, it may occur sooner, but I really think these are highly probable to happen at some point. So at some point, I believe we're going to see a tightening throughout this year, contrary to what people believe. And I believe that because the government is stupid. You have to remember, and if you really look into how economists learn economics, the ones that work in central banks, it will scare you to death, believe me. So the thing is, guys, they are going to tighten. And by the time they realize the tightening has done damage to the economy, it will already be too late. Just like inflation. Inflation may have already pushed us into a recession, but these things don't happen instantaneously. It's not like inflation spikes and then all of a sudden you have a recession the next month. It takes 6 months to a year for that to unravel. So we're probably going to see that towards the tail end of the year. And I think when we start to see that really struggle, the growth struggling, unemployment starting to tick back upwards, that's when they'll start to reduce rate. Now, interestingly enough, house prices, double top, what is going on there? And this could actually go higher than the previous high. And the reason I'm calling a double top is because it's psychological. There are a lot of people that as soon as housing prices dip, they are going to jump in and it's going to push prices higher, but it's going to be a short-lived thing. And this always happens after a mad frenzy run. You've got all these people that are sat on the sidelines and they're just waiting until they can afford the house. They don't care about fundamentals and a crash or anything like that. They're not concerned about that. They're driven by FOMO. So they're literally just waiting until prices get into the bracket they can afford, and then boom, they're in there. And that is why I'm calling a double top right there. And the interesting thing that I want to point out is this lag zone between prices dropping and interest rates going down. A lot of people are saying, oh, well, the federal government will step in, they'll save the housing market by lowering rates even lower. Well, the thing is, they tried to do that after 1989 and it didn't work. In fact, housing prices fell for 5 years whilst they lowered rates to an even newer low. So that's like going down to negative rates. And it was actually only when they started to tighten around 1994, 1995, and it's Roberto that I can thank for this because he gave me a great lesson on this, and I went and did some research, bought some books that I've been reading. He also sent me one, and it's just phenomenal to learn about the similarities. So I think because the government is stupid, as we know, we're going to see this double top. The other thing that I want to point out, when supply is low and prices are going up, that only pushes supply lower, but eventually prices will level off, whether that's because of interest rates or it's even because of inflation. The thing is, guys, that's what people don't seem to realize. The housing market isn't just dependent on inflation, I mean interest rates, it's also dependent on inflation because it affects this, the household income spend gap, which is more important. So anytime this household income spend gap is being pushed lower, whether it's by inflation or interest rates, that's a big problem for the future housing market. Now, another thing that I want to point out here is just really the interest rates. They are 1.25% I've put there. And you might think, well, that's really low and it won't do anything. Well, the fact is there's so much debt in the system. There's so many variable rate loans that will absolutely put way more stress on this household income slash spend gap because again, it's going to push it even lower. And the thing is, guys, I actually think inflation might continue. This is being generous, saying that it's going to come back, but I think inflation may actually continue. And the thing is, if you look at how the CPI is actually structured, which is what the talking heads like Madman McLean, as Jeff calls him in the comments, says, is basically they think that the CPI is accurate. You have to remember, guys, these people are not normal people. They don't associate with the types of me and the types of you. So the thing is, they think that CPI model is accurate. They think that they can actually control inflation. They don't realize there's actually no evidence to suggest that interest rates going up and down actually does anything to affect inflation. In fact, the only thing it does is because eventually they push the cost of everything up so much that eventually, yes, things start to deflate, but they're bubbles that generally the central banks inflated in the first place by shoving rates down so low. So just remember that the reason we have these bubbles is because of the central banks, and they're the same people who collapse the bubbles. So, but there are some things which are interesting with inflation that are keeping it high. That's what's going on in China. China's growth is slowing, and if that continues throughout 2022, if China heads into a recession, that's a big game changer, because that is going to mean they're going to start producing less things, which is going to lead to higher prices. So the thing is, inflation is really a hard one. And picture this. The housing market collapses, inflation is raging higher. What are central banks going to do? And this is exactly why I'm leaving Canada, guys, because we're going to talk about the CMHC and their role and the fact that they're going to be picking up the bill for all this carnage and mess which has been created by the banking system and the central bank and the government, obviously, for not regulating it properly. But the real scary thing is, what on earth are they going to do if inflation is raging, going to the moon, but house prices are going down? They're going to have a real problem, because the banking crisis that would occur, they would need to generate enough liquidity to keep the banks going through quantitative easing and other methods. And it's going to be really difficult if rates are high. The government, to extend so much credit to cover all the costs of the loans that will be lost, it's going to put them in a very difficult position. A position that I think was very similar to the position that Greece got itself in. Now, you might be thinking, whoa, Luke. Greece is not like Canada. Canada is a much nicer country. We're much better here. But the thing is, we're not, just as we can see by this chart. And the fact that the banks have took on so much risk just means that we are in such a precarious place. It may mean mass austerity, and it may mean the government defaults. And governments have defaulted in the past, and they can default. So if the government, if there is people out there that think the government might default, that will lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy, just like we had in Greece. But the thing is, unlike Greece, there's no Eurozone to bail us out. So what would happen in that situation is anybody's speculation. But anyway, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really hope it proved helpful and the illustration was somewhat helpful. But anyway, guys, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel for more great content, and I will see you in the next video. Take care, guys. Peace and love. Bye-bye.